QSO Today, episode 240, George Allison, K1IG. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur, who are excited to announce the new IC 9700 VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz all-mode transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, Hans Sommer's G0UPL's kit company, and creators of many fine radio kits, including the popular QCX transceiver kit. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Links to both are on this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth4Z1UG, your host. Like many of my guests on the QSO Today podcast who were inspired in the 1950s by the Russian-launched Sputnik satellite, my guest this week began his ham radio career before even starting high school. George Allison K1IG shares his ham radio story that includes a U.S. Navy career, a South Pole visit, VLF and ELF antenna arrays used by the U.S. Navy, and a discussion of copying CW at 40 words a minute by using his Wordsworth CW method. George is as excited now as he was when he started his ham radio career over 50 years ago, and he is my QSO today. K1IG, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, George?
Eric, 4Z1UG. This is K1IG in Westford, Massachusetts. You're loud and clear.
Great, George. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Sure. I was one of the baby boomers and kind of a child of Sputnik, too. When I was young, I was always tinkering. There were no hams in the immediate family. I had an uncle who was a ham back in 1916. And in fact, we have pictures of his shack, but I could never find if he had a call. But anyway, when Sputnik went up, that kind of changed everything because the schools were really pushing science, and there was a lot of popular material and magazines and such. So in junior high school, I was reading all those things, popular science and popular electronics, and especially the Carl and Jerry stories that were in popular electronics. And then in 1961, an uncle sent our family a shortwave radio, and it's one you probably never heard of. It was the Hallicrafters TW1000, which is a clone of the Zenith transoceanic radio. It was designed for armchair shortwave listening, probably in your living room. Had no BFO on it, but it had this great big glass dial, and it was labeled with the various foreign broadcast stations. And there was also about a half an inch at 4 megacycles, is what they called it then, labeled amateur, and another quarter inch at 40 megacycles. So I started listening to that and really got the bug. I had to do this. So I ordered the 4 ARRL books. There was a package of 4, like how to be a radio amateur and learning the code and operating manual and such, and got the Amico code record. So that was probably in late 1961. And then I bugged my parents and got an SX110 for Christmas, which was a pretty good radio, and then laid out a plan to get licensed by the spring. So in reading the books, I really didn't want to be constrained with all those novice or tech restrictions. And at that time, the novice was only good for a year anyway, and then I'd have to upgrade. So I figured I'd just go for the general. So studied up for that, listened to the W1AW broadcast for about half an hour a night or so. And the other big reason I had to go for general was I didn't know any hams. So nobody could have given me the test, and I figured I'd just go into New York City, which was close to where we lived, and take the test there. So studied the manual alone and listened a lot. I don't know if you've heard of a guy named W2OY. He had this booming AM signal. I think he lived near Buffalo, but he had a very unique way of calling CQ, and I can still remember it too. It was he would call CQ and then say no lids, no kids, no space cadets.
Yes, I've heard that.
Yeah, Class A operators only, no wet bottoms, and no school bus riders. I never heard anybody come back to him, but I'd say he was an influence on me. One thing I didn't want to do was be a lid. So then in spring break, which was April 62, rode the subway with my dad into New York City to Washington Street, which is where the FCC office was, went up to the 7th floor, and I think there were about 30 in there to take the test. So we had the code test first, and the examiner in the front of the room had this machine, and it was very efficiently run. You just sat down, put on these old metal headphones, and they started the test. And I was writing as fast as I could. And as soon as that last character was sent, the proctors of the test ran down the aisles and grabbed the paper so you couldn't change anything. Then we waited about 20 minutes, and they called my name. They gave me a sending test then, and then the written test, which I had studied pretty well for, so passed it all. And then about 4 weeks later, I was WB2BEF.
WB2BEF, like
right.
Baker Echo Foxtrot. The device that they used to send the code to you, was that an instructograph with a paper tape?
I think it was. I was way in the back, but all I could see was this big black box up there. So it probably was the instructograph. So had to get a transmitter and an antenna. So the place to go to at that time was Harrison Radio in New York City, which was on Greenwich Street, which is about where the financial district is now. And that place was just huge. And it was, for a 14-year-old kid, that was just wonderful. They had all these shelves of Collins gear and all kinds of equipment. You go in there and twist the dials and all. And the best thing was it was right around the corner from Cortlandt Street, which was Radio Row, which was just blocks and blocks of electronic surplus stores, which is where I bought my first telegraph key. It was a J38, which I bought out of a big barrel of telegraph keys they had. It cost me 65 cents. And I think I see them on eBay now for $80. So I should have bought that whole barrel, I think.
Right.
So anyway, at Harrison, they convinced me to buy a used DX100. And this thing was a beast. It weighed 100 pounds. So it took my dad and me to carry it out to the car and put it in there. It had two 6146s, and I guess it put out about 120 watts. But that was a bear to try and operate. It was very cranky and temperamental, and just was difficult to use. We got a Mosley vertical antenna, which was basically just one element of their tri-band beam. It covered 10, 15, and 20 meters. And not knowing any better, I put it on the roof, although I did know enough to put radials on it. So that was the station for a little while.
How old were you when you got your first license?
I was 14, and again, didn't know anybody who was a ham, didn't get any help on it, just kind of studied on my own and listened to the radio.
Well, your father sounded very supportive. Once you had the general class license, did you join a club or did you meet any hams in the neighborhood?
Yeah, so I started doing a little bit of operating, and I should probably tell you about my first contact, too, because that was a memorable experience in more ways than one. I was trying for weeks to make contact with somebody, and I had a Heathkit SWR bridge, so I used that to tune the antenna, and from what I could tell, it was tuned up pretty well. But I tried for about 2 weeks, and I answered CQs and called CQs both on CW and voice and just couldn't get anybody. And it was getting kind of frustrated. And again, bear in mind, I really didn't have any training in this, had no Elmers, didn't really know how to do all this. And I was just listening to W2OY, so I knew I was a kid, but didn't want to be a lid. So one night, about 9:30, I called CQ on 20-meter CW, and a guy came back to me. I couldn't believe it. So I yelled out through the house, I got somebody. And of course, my parents come rushing in. And then, of course, panic sets in. So I forgot all my code. And just started writing down dots and dashes and occasional letters. So the next day, I was able to figure out what this guy sent. I had sent him my name and QTH and all that. And he came back to me and sent solid copy back to you. But that's not quite what I copied down.
Right.
What I interpreted that to mean was so, comma, lid, copy, and then a four-letter word that's kind of like back, but not quite, to you. So my initial panic now is replaced kind of with shock and awe. And I'm thinking, it's my first contact, and I've been identified nationwide as a lid. And my parents in back of me are yelling, "What did he say? What did he say?" And I looked down at this text and looked up at the dial and spun the receiver dial and just said, "I lost him." And that was kind of my introduction to it. But after that, the next day I got on the air again and started making good contacts and meeting people in the area too.
So what do you think was you tried for months to have a single contact? Why do you think you ended up having success after that night?
Well, it's just confidence, really. And there may have been people coming back to me, but I just was unfamiliar with tuning the receiver and all. And really didn't know what I was doing. So it took some practice. One thing we did, the DX100 was just getting too much to handle, and it was blowing the final tubes often. So we went back to Harrison Radio, and I traded it in for a Ranger 2, and that was a much better rig. It was very easy to tune up and very stable, and that's what I operated with for the time that I was in high school. And so in making contacts, people talk about the 50s and 60s being the golden age of ham radio, but that was really, there was a lot of heartburn back then. And the biggest thing, of course, was TVI, which was a real showstopper. When I got on the air, people knew who I was because they'd recognize my voice and saw the antenna on top. So if I got on the air, say on 15 meters or so, which affects TVs because of their the second harmonic into the IF, we start getting phone calls. And there was probably several reasons for that. I had filters on my transmitter, and the signal didn't bother our TV because I put a high-pass filter on there. But TVs back then were kind of RF sponges in some ways. And so I kind of imposed my own quiet hours. I remember coming into school one day, and a girl came up and said she heard me on her TV, and she lived about a mile away. So I knew I was getting out at least. And I operated usually from about 1 to 4 in the morning. It was after the Tonight Show was off, and then till I couldn't stay up anymore.
Those days, as I remember, the televisions had 300-ohm twin lead running up to a big antenna on the roof, so there was no way you couldn't affect the TV. Yeah, corrosion would develop in the lead, so you have all these nonlinear junctions going on, and there would be it was just very difficult. And then the shortwave broadcasters were all over the bands, especially 40 meters at night was just unusable because of all the foreign broadcast stations there. I think Radio Moscow had like 3 channels that they used. Now, as you got to high school, did your high school have a radio club?
We did. It was in Garden City, New York, and we were K2 VST. We had about 5 or 6 in there who had licenses, and we got a couple more. We had a Johnson Adventurer transmitter. Unfortunately, there was no faculty who had licenses. We were sponsored by the physics department, so we had our little station in one of the physics classrooms, but the teachers really had no idea what this thing was or how to do it. So literally the inmates were running the asylum there. But we did make a couple of contacts there. It was not really a very active club.
But as peers, were they of great support to you?
I'd say they were. We did have, again, several who got licenses. So we had a lot of interaction among them. You'd go over to each other's house and play with their stations and such.
And did Garden City also have a local amateur radio club?
They may have, but I didn't know about it. No,
Mm-hmm.
no. And I was getting more interested in building things because the league was really pushing that. So there was an article in QST, and that was just about the same time I got licensed. I think it was May of '62. It was for a little 420 megahertz transceiver. It was a very simple design. So I went down to Cortlandt Street and scrounged some parts for that and tried building it, but wasn't having much success. So one of my friends recommended a friend of his named Vince O'Brien. He was WA2SVG, Sugar Victor Golf. And he was a tech, but he was really interested in building things. And he was in his 50s or so, I guess, when I knew him. But his occupation was a violin maker. So I went over to his house and into his shack, which was pretty small, but his basement was just filled with violins, violas, cellos, Irish harps in various states of building or disrepair. Really an interesting guy, but he was very meticulous. And he had built one of those little transceivers, and of course his was like a piece of artwork and worked fine. Mine didn't work so well. And another problem was it had this very expensive battery, a 45-volt battery. So I just kind of used it once and then gave up on it.
I remember having a portable radio with 3 of those batteries. A battery for the filaments, for the miniature tubes, and the 45-volt battery. That was a very expensive way to listen to the radio in those days.
Yeah, a friend of mine had a Heath Tour, the little crystal-controlled 2-meter rig, and he let me borrow it for a while. I used to climb up on the roof of the house to get a little more altitude because it just had this little stubby antenna on top of it. And I was able to make some contacts on there. It was kind of hard to use because you'd call CQ and then there was a little tuning knob. So you'd have to tune around to see if anybody answered. But I actually made about 5 contacts on that, I think.
Now, you say that your first homebrew project was this 420 megahertz transceiver. Are you still a home brewer, and how did your homebrew life prove after that?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm a home brewer. I did like doing kits. I built an HW8, which I still have, but the career I was in the Navy really was not conducive to having a lab or anything like that. So I was usually more of an appliance operator, I guess.
Did ham radio play a part then in the choices that you made for your education and career?
It played a part in everything I did. So I went off to college, and I knew from when I was 13 or so that I was going to be an electrical engineer. And after I graduated from high school, my parents moved to near Pittsburgh, so I got a new call, WA3DYK, and I was going to school in Philadelphia. Went to University of Pennsylvania there, and they had a college radio club, W3ABT, which was fairly active. They were big into teletype then. They had a big Helicrafters kilowatt, the HT32 with the kilowatt amplifier that went along with it, and a lot of teletype gear there too. I did some operating there, but kind of got more experience at it rather than doing a lot of operating.
Once you graduated, what happened after that?
Well, so I graduated. I was really interested in aviation then. I got a pilot's license while I was in college. And my first job was in upstate New York. You've heard of Link trainers, the aircraft simulators?
Sure.
Got a job up there. I was doing engineering, but really didn't like it at all. I was really bored out of my mind. And I was there for about a year or so, or a year and a half, and decided I just had enough. So I wanted some adventure and decided to join the Navy. And just intended to stay in for 3 years. But I got to my first ship, which was out in San Diego. It was a really small frigate. And they inquired into my background. I told them, well, I'm this ham radio operator too. So they said, okay, kid, you're the communications officer then. And that kind of started my communications career in the Navy. Being a communications officer there on that small ship was just a dream job for a ham because we had some serious radios. It was all HF and VHF. We didn't have any satellites yet. The carriers had them, but we didn't. So we had either 2 or 3 kilowatt HF transmitters. It was the URT-23. We had a couple of R390 receivers, although those were going away, and they were being replaced by another HF receiver, but I don't recall what the nomenclature was on that. So I guess we had about 5 or 6 HF receivers. We had a ton of VHF gear, which was mostly Army and Marine radios, so we could talk to the guys on the beach and also between ships. A lot of encryption gear, and then lots of clattering teletypes. It was really loud in the radio room there. You often had to wear earplugs because if you've got 7 or 8 of these teletypes going at one time, it's just deafening in there. HF antennas were all verticals with motorized tuners on the bottom. Plus, I had the signal crew too, the signalmen who operate the flashing lights on the ship. And I'd say ham radio was really a help on that job in many ways. First of all, the radiomen trusted me more because I knew what they were doing, and they could trust me to go up to the commanding officer and tell him why we weren't able to transmit this message because of propagation things. But the other thing that really helped was knowing Morse code, because I was the only officer on board who did, and the ships communicated over short range with flashing light in Morse code. So that was a good check on the signalman, because on more than one occasion, we would get a tactical signal, which was, say, words to the effect of turn left, and the signalman would report that it was turn right. And if we had turned right, it would have been at least embarrassing, but could have been a lot worse as well. And the other thing was, when we're in close range and the admiral on the carrier wants to send a personal message to the commanding officer of the ship, they always do it by light, because if they did it on the radio, then everybody could hear it. And usually the personal messages were not pleasant. So I could kind of nonchalantly stand on the bridge wing and watch the light flashing on the carrier and see that it was personal for the commanding officer, and kind of listen in on the conversations there too.
And now this message from ICOM America. I'm so excited to be able to tell you about the new ICOM IC9700 SDR transceiver. ICOM had in mind the weak signal operator when it applied its DSP and direct sampling technology to the IC9700's receiver design, allowing the operator to dig out the faintest signals from moon bounce and meteor scatter contacts. The ICOM IC9700 is a tri-band VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz transceiver. Operating modes include AM single sideband, FM, CW, RTTY, and all of the digital modes. You can even use the IC9700 to talk on the local D-Star repeater, making it an ideal rig for exploring the amateur bands 2 meters and above. For the satellite operator, the IC9700 has dual independent receivers that allow full duplex crossband operation with normal and reverse tracking, and 99 memory slots for your favorite satellites. The IC9700 is beautifully appointed with an almost identical footprint to the IC7300. It will make a beautiful sidekick to your current HF rig in your shack. With its 4.3-inch color touchscreen, you can easily control the rig and find the band activity using the waterfall display. To learn more about the IC9700 or any of the other fine ICOM products, go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur or click on the ICOM banner in this week's show notes page. And when you visit your local ICOM dealer to purchase your IC9700, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, you say you entered the U.S. Navy as a communications officer. How did you come in as an officer? Was it because of your college degree?
Yes. So all the services were hungry for people then in the late 60s, early 70s because of Vietnam. So they signed me up fairly quickly, and I went up to Newport, Rhode Island, to Officer Candidate School up there, which was about 3.5 months or so, and then went out to San Diego to get on the ship.
How did your military career proceed from there? Because it's my understanding that you actually retired in 2000, so you made an entire career of the military.
Right. Yeah, I stayed in about 29 years. And the Navy likes to shift their officers around to different jobs. So I went to another ship, and I was in charge of the sonar on there, and then went off to another school in Rhode Island. Yeah, this would have been in the late 70s, and that was where I got the HW8. There was a Heathkit store in Warwick, Rhode Island, so I drove from Newport up to Warwick and got the HW8, brought it back to the apartment where I was staying, and assembled it on the dining room table in there, and got on the air with that. Then in about the early 1980s, it would have been about 1981 or so, I went out to my next ship, which was also out in San Diego. But in the meantime, at about 1980, I finally persuaded my dad to get a ham radio license. He was in his late 60s then. And I gave him a copy of Tune in the World and said, this is what you need to do. So he did study up, and he got a license. He got a novice license first, and then worked his way all the way up to extra within about 2 or 3 years or so. And he was KD5KO. And then he convinced, my mother had died several years before that, so my dad had remarried. He convinced his new wife that she needed to get a license too, so she was KA5RXN. And at one time, they were both president of the San Antonio Radio Club. So they were catching the bug as well. So I got to the ship in where I was a department head in about 1981, and I was the chief engineer then, so I was the one in charge of all the ship's engines. I had gone to several schools that the Navy had for gas turbine engines, and one was north of Chicago at a Navy base they had, so I was able to use the HW8 there. And then at various other places, I could usually just put a wire out the window and had my old J38 key and could make contacts. So on this destroyer, we were going to make a long deployment on that, and I convinced the captain that we should get a Mars station on board. Now, he had never really heard of this, which I thought was kind of strange, but our executive officer knew what it was. He was a Vietnam veteran, and it was used extensively in Vietnam. So Mars, it stands at that time, it stood for Military Affiliate Radio System, and basically you had ham gear on ships and the foreign shore stations, and then there was a network of hams back in the U.S. And we operated outside the ham bands, but it was for morale. The sailors or soldiers could call home, make phone patches, or send messages. And so I went to Henry Radio in Anaheim, and we got a Drake TR7 and the 500-watt amplifier that goes along with it, which I think was an L75, and we got a tuner. Brought it back and put it on board, and we got an empty space that was near the top of the ship, and just strung a wire up to one of the yard arms on the mast. So it was probably 40 or 50 feet long or so, and operated with that, and it was spectacularly successful. We went out to the Indian Ocean, and we were making calls every day. As long as we weren't doing classified operations where we had to shut the radios down, we could have good contacts back with the U.S. There was a guy in Ohio that was our main contact, and it was surprising. I guess when you've got an infinite ground plane around you, the signals work out better. But the captain told me that was the best thing he had ever seen for morale. And figure, too, at that time, out in the Indian Ocean, mail would take, say, 4 to 6 weeks for a turnaround. You mail a letter, and then 4 to 6 weeks later, you'd get something back. So we could have the guys contacting their family every day. In fact, the word got around to the other ships in our group that we had this station, so people were helicoptering in to use our Mars station on there.
How did Mars influence your ham radio life?
That's really an interesting story, because I was kind of touched by Mars, the military affiliate radio system, virtually from the very beginning of my ham radio life, almost until the very end. At the time I started, most overseas bases for Army and Navy and Air Force had a Mars station on board, and they were usually very well equipped, too, with top-of-the-line gear, the Collins S-line with the big amplifier and all, because, again, at that time, the Mars station was about the only way that the deployed personnel could contact home, and they did it by phone patches to the network of hams that were back in the U.S. So the stations were very active, and in addition to the Mars station, these stations generally had a ham radio call sign assigned to them as well for a club station. So if there was a ham at the base, that ham could operate the Mars station using the club's ham radio call sign. And what that really meant was a lot of places that are considered rare DX right now, places like Johnston Island, Midway Island, were easy to work then because they had very active bases and ham stations on board as well. And that accounted for my first DX contact, in fact. I was still in high school, and it was, I think it was January of 1963. And I came home from school and just turned on the radio and was tuning around the 15-meter band. And I heard the station at the Canal Zone. It was KZ5LW. That was the call sign for the Canal Zone military base down there. And he was coming in on AM just loud and clear. So I thought, well, I'll risk the TVI and I'll give him a call. So I gave him a call, and he came right back. So we started chatting, and that was my first DX AM contact. But, of course, as soon as we started to talk, the phone rang, and I knew what was coming, so I figured I had to cut it short. So I started signing off, but I could hear my mother in the kitchen. She had taken the call, and she was yelling into the phone, "But he's talking to Panama." And but I did get the card from him and got a good contact. But so the Mars system there was really my first introduction to DX. And when I was in the Navy, I operated from the bases wherever I was. The stateside bases all had stations too, so I operated at the stations in Rhode Island and California, and then out in Hawaii as well. So on the ship I was on Ingersoll, we left San Diego, made a long deployment, and we were out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And the Mars station was a very good morale booster for the crew, because we had very good comms at that time back in the U.S., really from the middle of the Indian Ocean. But then right in the middle of our deployment, the final amplifier tube blew out in the linear amplifier we had. So we were just operating barefoot. We thought we were going to be offline, but it really didn't affect our operations much at all. We were able to maintain contact. Maybe we were diminished by about half an hour a day or so. But we contacted Henry Radio back in Anaheim, and they contacted Drake, who sent us a new amplifier tube for free. So about 3 weeks after the tube blew, we were back online and operating again really well. So again, the Mars stations were very much appreciated by the crews there.
Now, was this an exception in the case of the USS Ingersoll that they had a Mars station that was maritime mobile? Did all of the ships in the Navy have Mars stations?
Actually, no. The big ships, the carriers, the ships that had, say, a crew of 700 or 800 or more would have it. But on the small ships, usually they just didn't have the expertise to put up the Mars station, or people just didn't know about it. It was legally possible for hams or the Mars stations to use the shipboard communications gear to make contacts, but that was, although it was legally possible, it was practically impossible because of all the hoops you had to jump through. Plus, the shipboard gear was always in use in operations too, so it just wasn't available. Plus, the shipboard gear really isn't good for ham radio because it's all channelized, and hams want to be able to have continuous tuning. But nonetheless, I was occasionally able to use the shipboard HF station for maritime mobile contacts, but that was something that really wasn't successful either, because the other ham would always ask, well, where are you? And I'd have to say, well, I can't tell you. And they'd have to wait for a QSL when we reveal where we actually were. But when we would go to foreign ports, I was usually able to get on an HT while we were still out at sea and approaching port. This was on just 2 meters, and get on simplex or occasionally raise a repeater, although that was kind of rare. But in Australia especially, we made a circumnavigation of Australia, hit 7 ports there. And usually when I was out, say, 15 miles or so, I could make a contact. And by the time we tied up to the pier, there would be hams on the pier waiting for us. So I give them a tour of the ship and then go out to their house and see their station too. So wherever you go, there's a ham there who wants to talk.
Now, did you find that was true in other countries besides, in other ports of call besides Australia?
Usually, no. I just didn't try it because of language barriers, or just because of the tempo of operations. The Australian cruise was kind of a Liberty Port cruise, so we were encouraged to make contacts with the locals there.
Now, is Mars operation in the Navy? Is it still operational? Are there still Mars stations operating?
The Navy Mars has pretty much disbanded now. It's been absorbed by Army and Air Force, and that happened in about, I think it was about 2015 or so. And the main reason was there was just no need for it anymore. The ships have satellite gear, and so the sailors can make calls back home via the satellite, and the HF is really not needed anymore.
Now, did you have other Mars operators on the ship?
Oh, yeah. So I recruited several of the enlisted people. They were mainly sonar operators and electronics technicians. I think we had either 4 or 6, and they were the ones who actually operated the station. And our call sign there was NNN0 Charlie Whiskey Echo.
Okay, now did they have to be ham radio operators to operate Mars?
No. The only thing we had to do was I had to give them training and certify that they were trained, but they needed no licenses or anything. Again, we didn't operate in the amateur bands, so it was really a military controlled operation, and the Navy Mars were the ones who wrote the rules for us.
Maybe you've got some insight into today. Do sailors on board aircraft carriers, for example, do they still use Army Mars or Navy Mars on?
No, that is long gone. Mm-hmm. In the 90s or so, we started getting the satellites on all the ships, and the ships now have internet access, so there's really no need for HF at all. HF is pretty much gone.
And are people using Skype or other like WhatsApp or voice services like that, to their families from the internet access on the ships?
I've been out of this line of work for about 20 years. I believe that they do, but don't quote me on that. But they do have pretty good internet access, I know, on the ships.
Hey, this is Eric with this quick break. I'm a big podcast listener with over 20 podcasts loaded automatically into my smartphone every week. My favorite ham radio podcast is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George KJ6VU and Jeremy KF7IJZ. Every other week, George and Jeremy take a deep dive into their workbench projects that become boards and plans on their website. If you're a ham radio builder or want to be a home brewer, then be sure to click on the link to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast in this week's show notes page. I saw a picture that you sent to me that shows you on the South Pole. How did you get to the South Pole, and why were you there?
Well, that was a few years later. It was about the mid to late 80s or so. I got some promotions, and I was the communications officer for Third Fleet. So at that time, Third Fleet owned all the ocean from about the west coast of the U.S. Out to Hawaii and a little beyond, and then north and south. But they also owned Antarctica. At that time, Navy ran all the logistics for the U.S. interests on Antarctica. And so, of course, I had to make an inspection tour down there. So flew down to Antarctica, and to get there, first you fly down to Christchurch, New Zealand, where there's a big logistics depot, and you get outfitted with all the clothing you need. And they give you a big duffel bag that's about as big as you are to fit all this stuff into. And then fly from Christchurch on special C-130s that have skis on the bottom, and then land at McMurdo Sound, which was a huge Navy base then. So I spent a little bit of time there and got to know everybody, and then saw what they were doing, and then got the flight down to the pole, which was also an interesting experience. It's about a 3-hour flight. And I give credit to these guys who recently have been walking there, because you fly over and you just see mountains sticking up through the ice, and then deep crevices, hundreds of yards deep. And then you don't realize that the pole is actually at an altitude of 9,000 feet because it's on almost 2 miles of ice. And so we're on this plane. The plane is just a cargo plane because everything is flown into the pole, all the food and the logistics materials, all the building materials, the fuel, everything. So the passengers are kind of an afterthought. So they had these little web seats for us on the sides of the plane. There were just a few of us who were in the plane going down there. And then about an hour and a half before we land, they say, well, we have to acclimate all the gear on board to the temperature, because they can't just roll it off or it would sink into the ice. So the heat is turned off in the plane, and it gets cold real fast. It gets well below zero. So now you're in this cramped little web seat, wearing all this clothing, trying to stomp your feet and clap your hands to stay warm. We finally land at the pole, and now you can get out and warm up. The pole there, I said it's 9,000 feet, but it actually feels higher because the rotation of the Earth and the centrifugal force pulls air away from the pole. So the altitude feels like about 11,000 feet. There's no humidity at all. It's just bone dry because it's technically a desert there. The air is very thin, so your metabolism just skyrockets, and you just start eating, and you eat, and you're eating more food than you've ever eaten. The mess hall there was open 24 hours, and you go in and have double helpings of mashed potatoes, meatloaf, and for dessert a big helping of mac and cheese, and you still lose weight. I was there for 48 hours and lost 5 pounds. But of course, the first thing I did when I got off was say, "Where's the ham station?" And they took me in. At that time, the pole was covered by a big aluminum dome, and inside were boxes that looked kind of like railroad cars or refrigerator cars, but they were warm inside and cold on the outside. And the ham station was there. It was KC4AAA. And so while I was there, I got to assist the chief operator there, making a couple of calls and some Mars calls too. Called back home to the family, and again, got to operate the station.
Now, our visits to the South Pole, those are seasonal, right? I mean, there's a period during the year when you couldn't go there.
Yeah, so I was down there in January, which is their summer. At that time, the flights were in and out of the pole just through their kind of their spring and summer months. So I think they started about November or so and went to February or March. I think those were the approximate dates. And there was a small crew of about 18 who would spend the entire winter there. Then when the sun came up again, the flights would start. And at that time, the crew size of the pole was about 60 during the summer, I think.
Do they vary the lighting inside the environment in order to simulate evening and stuff like that, even though the sun is shining all summer?
Yeah, so just in the bunk rooms they do, but in the offices they're just open all the time, and the sun it comes up once a year, it goes down once a year. So when you're there, it's just making this kind of circle around the sky around the pole. Yeah, it is a different life there.
I'm sure. Did you see any penguins?
No. I saw a couple at McMurdo, but there's nothing at the pole. There's no vegetation or life forms there at all.
The station at the pole is at the pole. It's about as far south as you can go.
They have a little ceremonial pole there. In fact, that's on my QRZ page where I'm standing next to it, but that's near the dome. And so the dome is, at that time, was about 100 yards from where the pole is. And the pole, the South Pole, that pillar is actually moving around because the ice sheet is moving. So it moves a few feet every year. And it was just a kind of a rare experience to go down there, much different than anything you've seen before.
Now, was that an international station, or were there other countries represented at the South Pole with different facilities?
Well, the South Pole is governed by international treaties, so it is essentially a disarmed area, and there are no restrictions on anyone going anywhere. So although the South Pole Station itself is owned and operated by the U.S., anybody can go down there. In fact, a few years ago, I think there were tourists flying down there from Chile on little twin otters, and you can't restrict them from going there because, again, there's no laws to keep them out. So it's a kind of a free and open area, although it is the remoteness of it kind of keeps people out.
What is the Woolen-Weber antenna, and how did it play a role in your military career?
So after I finished most of my sea tours, which was about, it would have been 1993 or 5, no, 1995. So I had finished sea tours, and I had done a tour over in Turkey as well. The Navy decided they needed some payback for all this education they'd been giving me, so they sent me to Guam to run the communications station there. And this is just an enormous station, or it was then. We had two different sites, each with hundreds of acres. The transmitter site, which had all the big transmitters and the transmit antennas, was in one area, and then 8 miles away or so was the receive site with the receive antennas and all the satellite gear. The transmitter site was so large that it enclosed an 18-hole golf course, and we had antennas all over the place there. We had so many HF antennas, which were the big log periodic arrays. They didn't even have rotators on them because we could just select a different antenna for just about any bearing that we wanted to transmit on. The transmitters were big 10-kilowatt Continental transmitters, just regular broadcast equipment. Then at the receive site, we had a lot of HF receive antennas plus all the satellite gear. So the satellite gear, we had several 60-foot steerable dish antennas, a multitude of smaller satellite gear, ranging anywhere from, say, 6-foot helixes up to large 20, 30-foot dishes as well. The Woolen-Weber antenna was used for HF direction finding. This was invented by the Germans during World War II, and it's basically a circular array of vertical antennas. There are several hundred of these antennas, and the whole thing is about 250 yards in diameter, used for HF direction finding. And this was just huge. It was the pilots flying into the various airfields around there would use that as their primary marker and just call out the elephant cage. It's long gone now. It was, again, HF has gone away, and it went down probably a decade or so ago.
So in my reading about this, each of those vertical antennas around the circumference of the Woolen-Weber antenna was the driven element, and then there was a reflector behind it?
No, the way it was, the antenna covered 2 to 30 megahertz. So there was one array of vertical antennas which covered, say, 2 to 7, and then the other array covered 7 to 30. And the lower frequency arrays were in back, or the kind of the inner part of the circle, and the higher frequencies arrays were in front. And then it was strictly a receive antenna. So the antennas could be combined and steered, or the beam of the antenna could be steered around with devices inside a building, which was in the center of the array.
It was used for direction finding by all sides. It's my understanding the Russians also had them.
Yeah, just about every country has had these.
And they were using to find friendly and enemy aircraft or radios or...
What I can tell you is they were used to find signals of interest, I guess would be the best way to put it. And it was very active. We had a huge crew out there. On the station itself, we had about 1,200 in the crew. And the people operating the array, there were about 200 of those. But the first thing that happened was we did away with them because using internet and other things, we could remotely operate it from other places other than in Guam. So we were able to downsize then. And then eventually, again, HF just went away. There was nothing to do direction finding on.
You were also worked in a 2 million watt or 2 megawatt transmitter. What was that for?
So that was my next job. After Guam, they sent me to Washington, where I was running all the Navy's communication stations. So there were 21 of them around the world. And we covered literally from just about DC to light. The DC part was down below 100 hertz and then up into the multi-gigahertz range for satellites. So one of the things we have to do is communicate with submarines. And RF will penetrate seawater if it's at the right frequency and if you put enough power into it. So in the late 1950s or so, we and most other countries who had submarines were building these big, very low frequency antennas and transmitters. And in fact, QST had a series of articles back in about 1961 and even before that on what these things were and exactly how they operated. In fact, QST, I think in 1962, had an article on how to build a receiver to receive the signal off there. The VLF antennas or transmitters antennas systems usually operated around 20 kilohertz or so, give or take, say 5 kilohertz. And they operated at an input power to the transmitter of about 2 megawatts. So the transmitter for these things used the ML, I think it was a 6696 tube. It was an IMAC, also called a 4CX 35000, and they were rated at 80 kilowatts. And the transmitter used 32 of these tubes. They were in push-pull, so they weren't all on at the same time. And the output of the transmitter was about on the order of a megawatt or so. And if a ham walked into that transmitter, there is nothing he wouldn't recognize because it was just like my Ranger 2, only about 1,000 times bigger. There was a big loading coil at the base of the antenna, which you could walk through, huge capacitors, and then this enormous bank of transmitting tubes. I guess it had an L network at the bottom of the antenna for loading. The antenna itself, figure that the wavelength at 20 kilohertz is about 9 miles. So you're not going to have a dipole. And the antenna we used, I think hams would recognize that too, because it was kind of a variation on a disc cone where you have a central spire and then a capacitive hat on top. So you have the coil on the bottom for the inductive loading, and then the central spire, which is actually radiating the signal, and then the capacitive hat for capacitive loading. The central spire on these antennas would range anywhere from 900 to 1,200 feet high, and the capacitive hat was an array of wires on the order of a mile in diameter. So these things were just immense antennas and just awe-inspiring to see them for the first time.
And what is ELF then? That's even lower than VLF, right?
That's even lower. So ELF is defined as below 300 hertz. There were some experiments made, again by the Germans, I think. They found that, again, the lower the frequency, the more penetration there is of RF. So the ELF transmitter operates at the US one operated at about 76 hertz. The Russians have one that operates, I think, at 82. But at 76 hertz, now the wavelength is on the order of, probably 2,500 miles. So even that big disc cone antenna would radiate nothing at all. So the solution they came up with, there were actually several solutions they had. The original solution was to electrify most of Wisconsin, I think, but that didn't fly. So what they came up with was a magnetic loop. That's kind of the antenna you use if you need just an antenna that's going to be a small fraction of a wavelength in size. But this magnetic loop operated again at about 76 hertz and consisted of basically it was a dipole antenna about anywhere from 14 to 30 miles long. And it was energized in the middle by a big transmitter, and then the dipole parts were just, they would look like power lines that you'd see. And they'd stretch out, again, say 14 to 30 miles, well, about 7 to 14 miles on either side. And then they'd just be terminated in the ground with big spreaders. And what happens is that the signal goes into this dipole and goes out the wires, goes into the ground, and then makes a big loop in the earth several miles deep. And that is your magnetic loop. And the efficiency, of course, is terrible. You put 1 million watts into this thing, you might get 8 to 10 watts out. But as the hams are finding with their VLF work, I think the hams are restricted to just on the order of milliwatts now, but you can communicate around the world with that. So it did work. It was decommissioned and torn down almost 20 years ago because the expense of operating it just didn't justify what its effectiveness was.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. When we spoke before we started, you said that you had a very interesting master's thesis project that you did while you were in the Navy. Could you talk about that?
I was stationed in Monterey, California in the mid-'80s or so. The Navy sent me there to the Navy's postgraduate school to get a degree in electrical engineering. And they had a very active ham station there, had about 100 members, and again, the whole Collins S line. I was able to maintain a sked with my dad every week from there. And for my master's thesis, I was thinking I got to work ham radio into this somehow. So I convinced him to let me do a thesis project on HF propagation, and found out there that if you can get one of the federal agencies interested in what you're doing, there's no limit to what they'll spend to help you out on it. So the project we had was to try to do HF direction finding with non-directional antennas, just vertical antennas. And for that, you are using a lot of mathematical calculations for time of arrival difference to the different stations. And of course, you need very accurate clocks. So we had atomic clocks at all these receiving stations. And we set up an experiment out in the Central Valley of California, where we had receiving stations in some of the cities there, Merced, Fresno, Stockton, and such, and then tried to get try to receive the signals and calculate the time of arrival difference to get a fix on where it was. And I learned a lot about ionospheric propagation in this thing because we were not really successful in getting a good fix. And the reason was the ionosphere just didn't cooperate well with us. If you're trying to receive a modulated signal, every one of the discrete Fourier elements of the signal is being refracted from a different altitude. So it just comes down as kind of a mess. But the project was considered a success because we were able to get the fix and figure out what was wrong, and maybe figure out better things for the future as well.
Well, it seems that given the distance, a skip distance, whatever frequency you chose, that maybe that those receiving stations actually have to be spread out across the country and not just the Central Valley?
That was the next thing to try. We were just trying to go with, say, single hop or even less at that time. Maybe just a
ground wave.
Right. And to see what we could do with that. And one of the stations was getting a single hop. But again, the problem was just fixing the ionospheric height. We had sounders we could use to get a good fix on it, or to get a good height, but that was changing almost minute by minute as well throughout the test. So it was really difficult to get anything stable there.
Why do you have Turkish reciprocal licenses?
So I was stationed in Turkey in the early 90s, from about 93 to 95, and I thought I'd try to do some operating there. So I applied for a reciprocal license, and it took a while. It took a couple of months to get it. They assigned me a Tango Alpha 2 hotel, and I was living in an apartment in the capital there in Ankara, and set up my 940 there and tried to run an antenna out on the balcony that I had, but the conditions were just terrible. There was the loudest electrical noise that I've ever heard, so I could make very few contacts. Then about a year later, after I got my first license, they renewed it and gave me a new call sign. I was now Tango Alpha 2 Zulu Hotel. They never explained why they had a different call sign. I don't know if it was a typographical error on the first one or what, but I still have those licenses now. I have them framed. And but again, as I said, the operating was not good. There was just too much noise in the city there to be successful on it.
You won the Cover Plaque Award for your May 2017 article in QST, Increase Your CW Speed with Wordsworth. What is Wordsworth, and why should we use it to increase our CW speed?
So that came about as a result of a conversation I was having at my ham club. We were talking about CW, and a lot of guys there were discussing why it's so, or that it was so difficult to copy CW in your head. And I got to thinking about this, and my CW speed was always pretty good. And I tried copying in my head and failed miserably at it. I started first at about 30. And couldn't do that. I slowed it down to 20, and it wasn't until I got to about 15 words a minute that I was able to really get anything at all. And I couldn't understand why this happened, because I would think that it would be a pretty easy process just to take the CW that I had and be able to understand it in my head. So I did some investigation on this, and the conclusion I came to after all this investigating was that we've been learning CW wrong. That if the objective is to copy in our head, then what we've actually learned in the process we have is that it is to be unable to copy in our heads. And you wonder, okay, how do you learn to be unable to copy? In the process that we've had in learning CW is just kind of 180 out from what we should do. And my justification for that was looking at other means of absorbing information. The average person can usually read at about 225 words a minute using a visual alphabet, taking information through their eyes. But if you are blind and have to use Braille, they have a different way. It's just the dots on a page. The average blind person can read Braille after a year of very intensive training at about 125 words a minute. And after more training and experience, they can get up to 200 words a minute. So then I was thinking about our CW operators who think that 15 words a minute is good. And if they're doing 25 words a minute, they're saying, break out the fire extinguisher because I'm burning up the bands. And yet that's 1/5 of what a blind person can do with their fingers. And I'm just thinking, I can't believe your fingers are 5 times better at absorbing information than your ears are. So I went back to my original book, Learning the Radio Telegraph Code, and was reading that. And the process we have for learning CW is really unchanged now for about 150 years. You start out learning the letters, and you're counting the dots and dashes, and we hope that doesn't last for more than about 2 weeks. Then you start learning the sounds of the letters. And in fact, the W1AW broadcast uses the Farnsworth method, where they send the individual letters at a high speed and then give you a lot of space in between to learn that sound. And the objective is to develop this unconscious reflex of you hear da and you immediately write the letter A. You don't even think about it. And after about, say, a month or two, you do develop this, and you're pretty proud of it. In fact, when you do it, you're thinking, I'm not even thinking about this, and I'm writing all these letters down. And then, in fact, the League in Learning the Radio Telegraph Code, they give you a very helpful chart from the Army Signal Corps, who developed most of their methods, in fact, of how to write block letters very efficiently. So after you get to about 15 words a minute, you either stop there or you learn how to write script, and then you can get up to about 25 words a minute. But the upshot is that the process we have is just hear a letter and write it down and don't think about it. And we don't know what we've heard until we read it on the page. So the conclusion I got is your CW speed is not determined by any thinking process you have. It's determined by how fast you write. So we have one group of people that's 15 words per minute. They're the block letter people. Another group that's 25 words a minute. They're the script people. And we have learned how to get it out of our heads and make it totally unconscious. So now when you try to put it back into your head, the natural thing to do, and what I've seen in all the websites about high-speed code, is they say to imagine there's a piece of paper or a jumbotron in your head, and what you should do is hear the letter and display it on your jumbotron, and then when you have a word, you read it. And you just don't have the CPU power in your head to do this. You can learn to do it, but it's just never fun, and it's never easy. It takes an enormous amount of concentration because you've got your audio system in your head trying to decode these letters. Your video system tries to display them and then keep track of them, and that's the hard part. And then you have to read them back, and it's just piling layer of effort onto what should be just a communication process. And I tell people in the lectures I give, what we've done is to take this communication process, which should be cognitive and cerebral, and we've turned it into manual labor. We've reversed the Industrial Revolution and just made ourselves into these human teletype machines, and we've taken the understanding out of the process. So I figured, okay, how do we get our intelligence back into it? And what I did then was look back in how you learn to read. You know, we have I talked about reading in Braille, and when you first learn to read, you're in kindergarten, and they had those green cards up around the classroom with the letters written on them. You learn how to write them down, but then you immediately get into your circle with your teacher, and you start sounding them out and reading Dick and Jane and learning words. And you learn the word by sounding it out, and then you pause and think about it, and then you go on to the next word. And the process you have is scanning, which is the same thing the people with Braille do. You scan the words on the page, and you've learned how to convert these strange geometric symbols of the letters into words, and you understand them. And like when I'm talking to you now, I'm talking about probably 150 words a minute, but I know you're not displaying them in your head and then reading them. You're just absorbing them. So that's what we try to do now with Wordsworth. And the process is pretty simple. We just send complete words to you as fast as we can, so you learn to scan them and then give you a lot of space in between so you can understand them before you move on to the next word. And it seems to work. I give demonstrations at ham clubs, and I gave one at the New England Convention here. And the lecture takes about an hour, but at the end we have a test, and I play some code for them at high speed. And it's a simple thing that I send, but everybody gets it. And then we have a discussion on why their brain has been playing tricks on them and preventing them from doing that. But it seems to work.
But do you think that with the evolution of the Morse code, that the Morse code was always a third-party activity, right? You had somebody giving a telegraph operator a message that he's supposed to send that's supposed to be copied and written down by an operator at the other end who's supposed to hand it off to somebody to read.
Exactly.
Right. So in the evolution of Morse code, it wasn't a dynamic spoken language like you're advocating with Wordsworth.
That's correct. The role of the telegraph operator was to transcribe a message for someone else to read. And in fact, in learning the radio telegraph code, there's a quote in there that I use that they say the mark of a high-speed operator is your ability to copy at high speed on the typewriter, and that understanding or comprehension is really irrelevant to this whole thing, and they don't want you to understand it. But if you want to try it, it is possible to do it, and it can be just like a language.
Well, I think I've had this conversation, I think, with guests earlier on the QSO Today podcast, and that is this whole idea of whole word, how we learn to speak, and that it's a great idea for CW as well. Is there software or an app now to learn Wordsworth method for receiving CW messages?
Well, the app I used was FL-Digi, which is used for sending code, and I have a description in the article about how to take a long piece of text, say a whole story, and put it into FL-Digi and have it have the spaces between the words so that you can actually practice this. And it usually takes about 5 minutes of listening before you hear anything, but then you'll start hearing the shorter words, the, and, but, and such. And then it's just mind-boggling when you start hearing these longer words, and you're not hearing them. It's not like someone's speaking to you, but you're just getting the information in your head, and it is amazing when it starts to happen.
What's your current rig, George?
Current rig, I have a K3 and a buddy pole. And I live in a condo, so I do have restrictions here. I tried first with an indoor antenna just in the attic. That didn't work out too well. Tried a magnetic loop, which was marginally better, but not well. But you've interviewed Scott, NE1RD. He was in our club here, and I talked to him about the buddy pole. So I got one of those and put it up, and I've had great success with that. The thing's only, I guess it's 20 feet long, but I've got 4-band DXCC. Worked all states, and working on now 80-meter DXCC with it.
So you've done all this DXCC on the buddy pole? All
of it, yes.
Oh, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
I mean, I had Buddy on as a guest as well, so I don't doubt that the buddy pole works. But wow, that's pretty surprising.
Well, when it's all you've got, you learn how to use it, and my take on that is that it's kind of a window of opportunity you have. If I had a station, say like K3LR, if he wanted to talk to Australia, he could do it for several hours a day. I can do it maybe a couple of minutes a week. So if you know what those minutes are, I can talk to Australia and get the contact.
Do you operate in the digital modes besides CW?
I do. So I've got a digital DXCC as well. I got many of those contacts on the JT65 and JT9, several on RTTY, and a few on PSK. I've been trying FT8, but I'm not convinced of it yet. It's kind of like oh boy, my computer just made a contact, but I'm starting to get used to it more.
Now, do you like contesting? Or do you just work DX for the awards?
I like contesting because that's how I get most of my DX contacts. And my preferred mode of contesting is CW, in fact, because you can make quick contacts. It's kind of challenging, and it's kind of fun. One thing I've noticed, too, is that it seems the average speed of the CW in the DX contest is creeping up. When I started out, the speed was about running 27 to about 32 words a minute. Now I routinely hear people going above 40. And in the last contest, I heard a guy doing about 42 or 43. So I thought, well, I'll have some fun with him. So I put the keyer up to 50 and sent my call sign, and he came right back to me, and we made the contact. And I think the reason for this creep is there are two reasons. One is a program called Morse Runner, which is a program for learning how to receive call signs at high speed. And it's really a well-done program. And I think most of the DXers use it before a contest because you can there's no limit on how fast you can go on it. And the other thing, of course, is CW Skimmer, which with hooked up to a panoramic receiver will display the entire band and everybody who's on in CW or code there.
I see. So it helps you confirm, or helps the operator confirm that he's actually got the right call sign.
Yes, and helps them find stations too, because it decodes everybody on the band.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
Huge. I told you about my dad and stepmother who got licensed, and then when I retired from the Navy, this was about 2000 or 2001, finally met the love of my life, and of course we had to go home and meet the parents. So we flew down to San Antonio, and the gift that my parents had picked out for my bride was a copy of Tune in the World. So they said, if you're going to be in this family, this is what you got to do. So she came back here and enrolled in a course, and she's KB1 LSH.
Wow. You struck the jackpot, they would say, right?
I guess so, yes.
Is she an operator?
Barely. She does get on. She's a tech, so she gets on the repeater here once in a while. But I think she just did it just to have fun and see what it was like. Do
you operate ham radio in the cars?
Yes, I've got a Kenwood, let's see, it's a TMD 700. So it's got APRS, and I operate that a lot. In fact, that was for a long time before I had a good HF rig set up. Operating the car on VHF was about all I did.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio today?
Well, to kind of follow on from one thing I said, the golden age of ham radio, I think, is right now, and I think it's just getting better and better. There's such a diversity of things to do and applications. When I started, you could get on a telegraph key or a microphone, or if you were really well off, you'd have a teletype machine. Now we have all these different modes, high altitude balloons, just all kinds of things to do. And the numbers are growing too. I think that the big challenge is we've got a lot of competition for young people. They can do robotics or computers or games, but I think the competition makes us better because we can interact with all these other competitors in the robotics. You can tell the kid, hey, you can have your robot controlled from miles away with this. And I think that I hear a lot of people in your podcast talking about trying to get kids into the hobby. I think that what's happened in ham radio is that we've had a lot of bulges in our numbers. When it first started out, I got this from QST articles I was reading back in the QSTs from the 1920s and 30s. They used to publish statistics every year on ages of hams. And in the 1920s, the average age was about 20 and was creeping up. In the 1930s, it was about 30 and got up to about 38 or so by the time World War II came. So I think there was this huge influx of people around the 1920s or so who just sustained the hobby. And then we had another huge influx with returning servicemen from World War II, and then the TV boom, and then, of course, Sputnik and the baby boom. It just had an enormous input. So I think there's always been an issue with getting new people into the hobby, but I think we're doing it better now. I see a lot of new people, and one thing I see is that the people coming in are usually older. They're not kids. They're people who were interested in this when they were kids, or they were licensed and then just dropped out for 30 or 40 years and now want to come back in. So one of the challenges is getting them to come back in and telling them, hey, this is a great place to be.
Well, I think with mortality ages rising, that a person who retires and gets into ham radio could be a ham radio operator for 30 years.
I think so. And I think that the ones we're getting into it at that age are having a lot of fun with it. They're finding out all these things we miss. Maybe a course we should have is, hey, while you were gone, here's what happened to ham radio, and get them back in with that. I think our licensing is cumbersome and too hard. I think we've got too many license classes. I think maybe just two would be fine. Just have an apprentice mode where they've got all modes, maybe some band restrictions and limited power, and then another class where they can do anything. I think the test should be easier. The license manual is like a college textbook. The license manual I had, I guess in the general portion of the license manual, maybe it was 10 pages or so. But we should work on getting it simpler, I guess, and just having them tested on the things that they really need to do to know.
Do you see kind of a ham radio renaissance in CW operation?
I do. I think that during contests, putting the PAN adapter on there, the screen is just white with all of the stations that are on there. And I think they've been maintaining roughly, I think it's like between 5,000 and 8,000 log submittals. So that means there's probably several thousand more who are on there but don't submit logs. And I think that CW is doing just fine. The no-code licensing had very little effect on it, I think. People are doing it now for fun rather than just having to do it to learn it and then forgetting it.
Is there a ham radio activity that you're not doing now that you think you're going to start this year?
I'm doing a lot of stuff that a lot of people don't do. I'm really into fox hunting now. We have an active fox hunting group in our club, so we're usually out every weekend running through the woods and trying to find things. And that's really a satisfying thing because it's like solving a detective story where when you actually find this thing. The other thing I do is the semi-annual frequency measuring test that has a very low turnout. I think if 130 people nationwide participate in this, they've had a good one. But I find that to be very worthwhile and challenging. You gain a lot of confidence in understanding your own equipment, and it really helps in DXing and contesting too. When I first started doing it, I found horrendous errors in my calibration on my receiver. But now I can recalibrate that thing to within a hertz easily, within 30 seconds or so. I don't know if you're familiar with the FMT, but it's conducted twice a year. It's sponsored by the league, but it's actually transmitted out of Oklahoma. It's K5CM down there, Connie Marshall, who sends out the signal. And the structure of it changes now and then, but basically he is on 3 different bands, and he'll do a call up for about 5 minutes and then sends a steady key for about 2 minutes. And you have to measure that. Then he waits about 15 minutes and moves to the next band. And then you'll spend about a day doing your data reduction on it to figure out exactly what that frequency was and then enter it on his website. And then the results come out within an hour or so of when it's about 3 days after the test that the results come out. And the goal is to get all 3 measurements within 1 hertz. And on the last test, I think about 60% of them were able to do that. Of course, getting it within 1 hertz is just kind of getting your nose in the tent, as they say. What you want to do is get it as accurate as you can. So I can usually get it within 1/4 of a hertz. And I've gotten one measurement that was just 1/100th of a hertz off with just my K3. You don't need any special test equipment for it. In fact, that's one thing you learn. In the website that you go to for the results, everybody enters their method and their equipment. And it ranges from the people who have tens of $1,000s worth of test equipment to some guy using a KX3 and an Android tablet. And one thing I've found is that the equipment has no relevance to the results. That what counts is how well you know your equipment, how well you got it calibrated, how well you understand it, and then your diligence in making the measurements and doing the data reduction right, and then not making some boneheaded arithmetic mistake. But I found that my DXing improved because now I'm spot on. I used to think I would get these DX spots and I'd always have to retune. And I was thinking, of course, there's something wrong with the spots, but it was my receiver, of course, that was in error. So the first time I calibrated, it was about 35 hertz off, which was pretty bad. But now it's spot on, and I have great confidence that it can stay that way.
When you're DXing, do you split tune?
I do. For the expeditions, I always do, and then for contesting, although I stay on on a kind of a single frequency or just answer on the same frequency that the DX station is on.
What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
I think just the innovation we have. That there's always something changing in it, and there's so much. It's spread out from being kind of a single-purpose electronics hobby to just being all kinds of things, whether it's public service or trying to build things and all the different things that we can do. And this is what I try to explain to people who are trying to put these things in their schools and stuff, that it's not an electronics hobby. If you're going to be a successful DXer, you got to know a ton of geography and international politics and all different kinds of things. And getting into public service, you interact with the various entities in towns who do the public service as well. So it's just a great hobby for meeting people and getting to know your community and the world too.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams?
For the returning hams, I'd say the hobby's getting better and better. There are opportunities everywhere for learning things. For the new people, no matter what your interests are, there's some part of the hobby that'll be fun. And there is just so much to do, and it can last with you your whole life. You can get into this as most of my friends did when they were 11 or 12 years old, and they're still doing it when they're 70, and it just gets better and better.
Right. We're still as crazy about it as we were then.
Yes.
It's a scary thing.
Yeah, and that's what I see with everybody I know. They may have been out of it. You kind of drift in and out of things, and I did. I was inactive for a while and then came back in, and again, when I had the opportunity, now I'm really active in it, and it's always rewarding, and it's always fun.
Looking back on your last 57 years of ham radio, do you think you can project what the next 57 years might look like?
I don't think I can project what's going to happen, but I can project that it's going to be fun and interesting. I think that as ham radio has progressed, we have just seen so many new innovations coming in ham radio itself, from if you think back where it was to what it is now, and then try to extrapolate that, there are all kinds of things that are going to happen. I think that the challenges we have are just to make sure that the hobby can stay relevant, that first of all, that we keep the spectrum we have, and plus get more if we can. So for that, we need good, strong national organizations in every country, and we can't stagnate. Don't think that everybody's just has to be on CW or voice. These new modes we have, I think, are really great for the hobby, and they're bringing the new people in. I think that what we will probably see is that the hobby is going to evolve in ways we just cannot expect. It may, I don't know if we get the telepathic chip implants or something, but whatever it is, the hams will be there first, I think. And if we can keep the hobby vibrant and challenging and relevant, I don't think we'll have any trouble attracting new hams. I think that ham radio will be seen as the place to be if you want to see new things, and the prospective hams will come to us instead of us having to work so hard to get them. But I think that things like FT8 and all these other new modes we have are really what is keeping the hobby going and making it fun.
George, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's been a gas. I learned a lot about the Navy that I didn't know about before, and about the Wordsworth method, which I'm going to use in order to boost my CW speed. So with that, I want to thank you and wish you 73.
Great. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you here, and I hope to hear many more of your podcasts as well. So 73, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with George. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K1IG in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.